Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Brandon. Welcome to Audio Addiction, where you can find latest album reviews. You can find our band interviews, and you can find other music-related content on the channel. I post Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's mostly interviews, album reviews. I kind of do on a whim, so if you see this, awesome. If you don't, hopefully you can share it, give it a like, and thank you guys for checking out the channel. If you're new here, greatly appreciated. I'd like to hear you kind of sound off in the comments of, at the end of the video to let me know what you thought about the record, because I'm very curious what you guys have to think about it. But tonight we're going to be talking about If I Die First, newest EP, My Poison Arms. So I had found out about this band because a lot of my friends on my Facebook page were sharing this band, and I wanted to know what the hype was about. Usually I'm not on that sort of wave, but however, a lot of people were saying this was really good, and I asked a few friends, in Facebook DMs what they thought about it, and they thought it was really good. So I felt like, might as well take the deep plunge into it and listen to the entire EP. But I know very minimal about this band. I know that Little Lotus fronts this band, and it also features other prominent members of the kind of emo rap community. I know there's two members from Ghost Main's live band that are also in this band. There is Travis Richter from First to Last. He's also in this band as well. So there is definitely kind of that super groove sort of aspect to this band that I found appealing. I did really like the single. So I'm gonna go through each track off this record, give you my thoughts and opinions on it, go through some pros and cons, and then finish it out with an overall rating. So the first track is called No Serenity. This has a cool little introductory breakdown to it. It's definitely the heaviest track off the record, kind of dialing in at around the 50-second mark. And it's pretty impressive, to kind of start off a track with just a really gnarly breakdown, and I appreciate it. It's really dissonant. It's very angsty. And I appreciate the approach from it. Lotus does some really interesting, some tight screaming. I thought he did, a solid job. But there isn't really anything else besides that to kind of, write home about. Just your atypical kind of just angry, dissonant breakdown. So I thought it was solid. But, the next songs is when it really gets juicy, which we're going to be talking about. So track number 2 is Where Needles and Lovers Collide. This was the first single off the record, and it was also the first song that I listened to. Obviously, I feel like most people that found out about this band was through this song, so that's very cool. But this one just has that, it just rings to me that classic emo, screamo sort of vibe to it. Basically, bands from the early 2000s are some of the bands that I thought of when I was first listening to this track were bands like Skylight Drive, Broadway, obviously from First to Last, a little bit of a little smidge of Pierce the Veil. I'd say more so in the kind of vocal department, especially Lotus's vocals. But I thought it was very tight. There's probably some more emo, screamo bands that I'm missing out on. Silverstein, early Silverstein, stuff like that. If you're a fan of that sort of stuff, you're going to enjoy this record a ton. But you can tell who they're influenced by, especially those bands and, bands in that sort of, kind of pool of music during that time. And again, I feel like they wear their influences proudly in a track like this. Little Lotus's voice actually surprised me a lot, pretty much a great deal. I would say not only in this song in particular, but just the whole EP in general. He has a really interesting clean vocal. I felt like on the same level to me as how I felt when I was first listening to Pierce the Veil. Again, not to kind of, compare apples to apples or anything, but, he has that kind of high register, almost borderline falsetto-y sort of voice to his, to his voice. And it's very appealing. So at least to me, and it does have that sort of nostalgia to it as well. Obviously not being too familiar with his more rap career, it's really impressive to hear his vocal range, not only from his screams, but also his cleans. It's really He really runs the gambit in this track, and I think he does a great job utilizing his vocals. I also think another impressive member in this group as well is Zubin. He contributes some vocals as well, and him and Lotus have a pretty distinct kind of tonality to them. You could easily pick them out in the tracks, which is very cool. And Zubin has this kind of like interesting kind of like lower kind of mid-register voice, and then obviously Lil Lotus has that higher kind of like more upper middle to high register vocals, and the way that they kind of harmonize is really tight too, and I think it really obviously, like I mentioned, distincts them from each other. Instrumentally, it's pretty solid as well. It evokes that kind of classic screamo sound that and love. If the bands that I mentioned you enjoyed, you're gonna enjoy this EP. As well as that, I think that Zubin adds some really nice piano, more specifically in the bridge of this track. It's a nice little melodic element that breaks up the song in a cool way. I'm not gonna say it's like insane, but I think it just really works with the whole vibe of keeping that shit emo, and I really appreciate that. There's some really damn good harmonies in this song. I would say more specifically in the chorus. I think that's the part where not only Lotus shines, but also just like the rest of the band in general. It's really where they hit that high peak in the track, and I appreciate that, as well as it just being overall a very solid opener track. Obviously No Serenity is the opener track, but this one feels like obviously the most full-fledged first track. So I really appreciate that. I think it's a solid single. I think it can definitely hold its own as a single, but I think it fits definitely way better in the whole grand scheme of the EP. So we're gonna move into track number 3, which is It Me or Your Secrets That Keep You Up at Night. This one has more of a melodic flow to it, which is different in terms of the track that preceded it. I think, again, they've done a really good job of making it interesting so far. And I was very curious how they were going to follow up Where Needles and Lovers Collide, because, that was such a solid opener track. And I was curious if they were going to maybe like go more in a melodic direction, if they're going to go more in a heavier direction, because obviously No Serenity was, pretty much just a large breakdown. But I appreciate kind of the more melodic approach to this track. It has a really interesting flow to it. I think the vocals were probably the most interesting portion of the track. The cleans have almost more of a free-flowing sort of harmony pattern to it in the verses, with juxtaposed by the screams that Lotus does, where he does more of a kind of call and response sort of vibe to it. And, vocally, very impressive. I think, they do a really great job layering it. I think Richter does a great job of kind of mixing, mastering this record as well. I feel like there's a lot of distinct kind of clarity when you're listening to it more so on like a pair of studio headphones versus maybe, more so like a speaker. It sounds a little bit more, I wouldn't say like boomy, but it definitely has a different sound to it than when you're listening to it with like some nicer headphones. So I probably recommend that as a way of listening to it. But again, you could probably get away with anything and it would sound pretty solid all around. Instrumentally, evokes more of a kind of melodic and kind of flowing vibe to it, which I appreciate. I think Sane, I hope I'm saying that right. If I'm not, I am completely sorry, dude. But this one, he just does a great job of jumping on this track. He's really smooth. I think he's definitely one of the more underrated members in this track in particular, especially in being a slower song. I think he does a really great job of kind of keeping the snare to like ride really interesting, and he had some really unique, like, to me, interesting drum patterns in a track like this, where it could easily get muddled and lost. So I thought he did a great job, so shout out to Sane. There's also this really cool breakdown at around the 3-minute mark that goes to around the 3 minutes and 40-second mark. It starts off super heavy with some like layered screams. I know that there's another member that does screams that I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but there's like four out of the 5 members do vocals, so it's really tight. But there's this kind of like layered scream going on. Obviously Lotus does that kind of like higher register scream, and then they had someone do like more of a like a growl kind of lower register scream, and I think it just works. Obviously coming from a more of a metalcore background, that doesn't really surprise me too much, but for those people who, maybe checking this out, it does have more of that sort of metalcore vibe to it, which I appreciate. And then at the end of the track, it kind of mellows out. There's some really nice singing that was kind of a preface to the beginning portion of this track. They kind of go back and do some, nice clean singing at the end to kind of close out the track, which I thought was pretty solid. So we're going to move into track number 4, which is Burying a Parent. The chorus is an absolute hit to me. I think that was like when I first listened to it, I was just like, this is so good. Like, it's so catchy. And it feels like it's ripped straight out of like the early 2000s, which I really appreciate. It has some really great melodies. The harmonies are super rich. I think they do a great job of kind of having those harmonies layered in like super nicely, and I appreciate that. They really cover the melodic spectrum, and for those who aren't familiar with the channel, or those who are familiar with the channel, you know how much I love harmonies, and this one just felt like they did a great job of kind of combining those sort of aspects in terms of the vocal prowess, and I really appreciate that. But the thing that kind of took me by surprise mostly in this track was the bridge. They had Zubin handle, a good portion of that bridge part, and I appreciate his softer, kind of more timid approach to the vocals in this track. I don't feel like you really hear that too much in any of the other tracks on this record so far. So it was cool to see kind of like almost, I wouldn't say emotional weakness, but it just felt a little bit more like of an emotional push on this track, which I like. And then just to kind of further instate that sort of emotional punch, Lotus does some really great screams to kind of, end out the breakdown. This one to me had all of the great elements of If I Die First so far. It has some really catchy stuff going on to it. It's got some really kind of more heavier moments to it, borderline to like post-hardcore. And it also just rings those nostalgia bells to me. This track just felt like I had been hearing it for such a long time, but is like brand new. So I really appreciate that, and I like that they are, invoking that sort of spirit of early 2000s post-hardcore and like screamo music. So we're gonna move into track number 5, which is 6 Foot Dugout Holes. This one's another really insanely catchy track. I think to have both Burying a Parent and 6 Foot Dugout Holes right after each other, I think was a really solid choice in terms of song structure. Much like Burying a Parent, this one has more of a higher energy feel to it from the more kind of like punk beat that the drums have going on at the base of the track, and then the more upbeat pop punk vibes in terms of the instrumentals. I thought that was really impressive, and it's also been cool to see them kind of take the nostalgia reins by the horns and just really roll with it. A lot of these tracks have that sort of nostalgia feel to it, and I think that's obviously what they're playing into, but it really works. I think they really evoke that old spirit, and it's impressive to see that, at least in my mind. Just obviously only knowing him from the aspect of doing kind of emo rap, a lot of these, the whole band particularly, other than the guy from First to Last, because I just know he's obviously likes that sort of stuff, but it's cool to see them pull this influence out in their music, because I think that a lot of there's a lot of correlation to emo rap, and obviously like screamo and like older genres as well. So it's cool to see them actually pull from their influences and put it in a track like this. I also thought it was really cool that the bridge was interesting as well. The ending of the song had this really kind of neat build up to it, and then they have this interesting sort of like cool gang vocal breakdown thing going on, and again, another really solid track, another really insanely catchy chorus in my opinion, and I thought this was another solid one. So we're gonna move into the last track of the EP, which is I'll Never Let Them Hurt You. This one's a cool little acoustic track to close out the record with. The way that they approach the vocals in this track is very cool as well. They have like a few different like vocal layers going on, as I've been stressing in this review in its entirety. They really did a great job in this track. I was genuinely surprised when I first heard this one too. I feel like that's just, I feel like what I've been saying so far is just I've been surprised and I've enjoyed it so far, but genuinely it's like it has that nostalgia pull to it, and I think it's really impressive to see a band do that. But getting back to this track in particular, Zubin's voice is really solid. I think that way that Lotus does his like clean singing, and then he also has more of a like a gritty tonality to his voice. I think that's really solid, coupled with the fact that there's some really nice harmonies on this track. Really makes it interesting vocally. I think, there's an acoustic guitar. There's Zubin does a little bit of piano, which is also just kind of fitting to more of a softer sort of emo acoustic track. And I think they just do a really good job of kind of taking turns singing, and then really kind of all meshing together in this really interesting like harmony overload in the choruses of these tracks. I thought it was a good way to end the record, and I think it's obviously a solid closing track. So some pros and cons that I have about this record. Some pros that I have, I thought that this one definitely has just the nostalgia written all over it. If you're a fan of like, as I've been mentioning a lot throughout this review, if you're a fan of like older 2000s, post-hardcore, screamo music, then this is going to be right up your alley. That's just plain and simple. I think if you really enjoyed Where Needles and Lovers Collide, then you're really going to mostly enjoy this entire EP. As well as that, I think vocally, the other thing that just impressed me was both Little Lotus and Zubin. I think they do a really fantastic job vocally, and really not knowing anything about them prior to this point, other than, what they do, in general. It was cool to see them in a different light, and cool to see them really show off their vocals, because they're both very talented vocalists. So I was very impressed in that aspect, and I think there was some really solid instrumentals. Was there anything crazy about them? No, but I think that the way that they're utilized and the way that they're used in a lot of these tracks, I think, ring true to the times of music that they are, emulating. So I appreciate that. So some cons that I have about this record, I feel like Lotus and also Zubin, as much as I've liked their vocals in general, I'd love to see them expand more register wise. I know Lotus would be, I would be curious to see kind of more of Lotus's middle to kind of lower register. I thought that would be very tight. And then maybe Zubin could do some like higher, almost like falsetto-y sort of vocals. I think that would just make for an interesting result. Have them kind of do almost like a role reversal or something like that. Just experiment more vocally. I think they have an opportunity to make stuff really interesting. And I think another big thing is instrumentally, as I mentioned earlier, I felt like, while they were solid, I think that they could be pushed to boundaries a little bit more. I think they could, incorporate some different sort of influences and stuff, or maybe not influences, but just maybe the way that they go about writing tracks going further. I know this is only an EP and it's only like 6 tracks, but I'd be curious to see how they going further in terms of the instrumental and just the way that they write music in general. I'd be very curious to see. But my overall rating for If I Die First, newest EP, My Poison Arms, I'm going to be giving it a 9.3 out of 10. I think it's super solid. Again, it really tugged at those like nostalgia vibes, and I definitely had a little bit of a nostalgia goggle situation going on here, but overall I thought it was very solid from front to back. There wasn't anything that I felt like was really bad, something that I feel like they should work on. But I think that overall, like, I appreciate them, obviously bringing back this sort of sound in this aspect, but I'd love to see them kind of experiment more and grow as a band. And I know that, I hope that they continue to write music under this name, and obviously supergroup. But I would be curious to see what you guys think. It's been out for, I think, like 5 days now or something like that. So let me know what you think. I really didn't see another review excluding somebody else on YouTube, so shout outs to him. And we're, hopefully trying to spread the word of this band, because I was genuinely surprised that there was like hardly anything out about this band so far. So go check out If I Die First. There will be links in the description where you can find out about their band, music, merch, if you want to pick that up. Again, if you're a fan of that older style, early 2000s screamo post-hardcore, then this is definitely the record for you. But if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe, hit that thumbs up, share it. It goes a long way. Plenty of new content coming from the channel. Keep your eyes peeled. I'll be announcing some new stuff, hopefully if not by the end of this week, into next week. So keep your eyes peeled, and hopefully you guys will check out new content to come. But as I said, my name is Brandon. We hope you got your fix, and we'll be talking with you soon. Peace.